The day I said goodbye to my father, I realized that the woman who had been by my side for 27 years had already made her own calculations about how much time I had left. It wasn't a letter or a message found by chance that revealed it to me. It was a moment of needing air. I stepped away from the room where everyone else was because I needed to breathe, because the weight of that day pressed on my chest like never before. Then, as I paused in the hallway and rested my forehead against the cold wall, I heard her. It was Lorena's voice, my wife, the mother of my son, the woman with whom I shared my life for nearly 3 decades. She spoke without lowering her voice, with the calm of someone who is certain no one is listening. The day I said goodbye to my father, I realized that the woman who had been by my side for 27 years had already made her own calculations about how much time I had left. It wasn't a letter or a message found by chance that revealed it to me. It was a moment of needing air. I stepped away from the room where everyone else was because I needed to breathe, because the weight of that day pressed on my chest like never before. Then, as I paused in the hallway and rested my forehead against the cold wall, I heard her. It was Lorena's voice, my wife, the mother of my son, the woman with whom I shared my life for nearly 3 decades. She spoke without lowering her voice, with the calm of someone who is certain no one is listening. Before continuing, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, as we share new stories every day. Don't forget to leave a like and tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from. My name is Agustín Torrealba Medrano. I am 53 years old and have worked as a state tax auditor for 26 years. It's a profession that trains you to read between the lines, to uncover what lies hidden behind numbers, and to never accept any document without first verifying who signed it, when, and above all, why. Yet none of that experience prepared me for what I heard on that gray Tuesday in November, as I stood in the hallway of my father's house, the air heavy with the scent of wilted flowers and the distant murmur of neighbors praying in the living room. My father, Isidro Torrealba Vega, was 81 years old. He spent 4 decades working as a maintenance technician in an electrical components factory in Valladolid, the same city where I was born and raised, where I learned the value of hard work. He was a reserved man, precise in his actions, not one for hugs, but always present when needed, not one to say, "I love you," but the kind who would take your car to the mechanic before you even noticed something was wrong. He died early on a Saturday morning after 8 months battling an unforgiving pancreatic cancer. I was by his side, holding his hand until it stopped squeezing mine. When I walked out of that hospital room at 4:20 in the morning, with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I thought the worst thing that could happen to me in life had already happened. I was wrong. My marriage to Lorena Fuentes Palomino began in September 1996. She was 21 and I was 27. We met at a co-worker's wedding, and I was drawn to her intelligence, her determination, and a sense of humor that disarmed me at the time. We got married a little over a year later in a simple ceremony at a small church in downtown Valladolid, surrounded by about 70 guests and a cake that leaned to one side throughout the entire reception. We laughed a lot that night. During the early years, we were what you might call a functional couple, never perfect. I worked too much and was absent more often than I should have been. Meetings I didn't cancel when I should have. Birthdays I arrived late to. Conversations I left unfinished because work always had something more urgent to offer. I admit it without excuses. But I was also the man who paid the mortgage without fail every month for over 2 decades, who made sure nothing was ever lacking in that home, who built, through his own effort, the stability we all lived on. I was physically present, but not always in every other way. That is the whole truth. Our son, Álvaro Torrealba Fuentes, was born in August 1998. He is now 26 years old and works as a sound technician for an events company in Madrid, where he has been living for the past 3 years, something I long saw as a natural step toward independence, but which I now understand in a very different way. My father's illness began in January. During the first months, Lorena offered to help with visits, to handle scheduling medical appointments, and to take care of the weekly shopping. I was grateful. I worked full-time, and the trips to my father's house took up much of my afternoons, so having someone I trusted there with him eased the burden. Or at least, that's what I thought. There are things you notice but don't truly register, details that are right in front of you, yet your mind labels as normal because there's no reason to suspect anything. Now, with the clarity that only time and pain can bring, I can see them all with an unsettling sharpness. The first happened 4 months before my father died. Lorena accompanied him to a notary. She mentioned it casually, almost in passing, while cooking dinner. She had gone with him to sign an authorization for managing medical matters, just in case. It seemed reasonable, practical. I didn't ask to see the document. The second came when a bank statement arrived at the house from an account I didn't recognize. Lorena explained that they had opened it to better manage the expenses related to my father's care, and that she was handling it. I simply nodded. That was Lorena. Organized, efficient. I never used to question those kinds of things. The third involved Alvaro, who during that time began avoiding eye contact with me during family visits. I assumed it was due to the anticipatory grief of losing his grandfather. It was the easiest explanation, and I accepted it. The fourth detail emerged during one of the last lucid conversations I had with my father. It was a Wednesday afternoon, with sunlight slanting through the window of his room. He looked at me intently and said, "Take care of what is yours, Agustín. Don't trust someone who suddenly starts taking too much care of you." I asked him what he meant, but he said nothing more. He closed his eyes and never brought it up again. I stored those words somewhere in my memory, like a folded piece of paper whose purpose you don't yet understand. As the weeks passed, that moment would eventually fall into place as the key piece that made everything make sense. On the day of the funeral, my father's living room filled with people who, in their own way, had cared for Isidro. Former factory co-workers now retired, lifelong neighbors, even a couple of cousins we hadn't seen in years. I spent hours receiving hugs, offering thanks, repeating the same phrases while my voice grew increasingly hollow. At some point that afternoon, without saying a word, I stood up and stepped into the hallway. I needed air, even if only for a moment. The hallway was cold. The door to the room on the right, the one that had been my parents' bedroom for decades, was slightly ajar. From inside, Lorena's voice came through clearly, calmly, with the confidence of someone who already feels the place belongs to her. "My father-in-law is dead." Silence. Now only he's left. Another brief pause. A soft, almost intimate laugh. "And everything they have will be mine." I froze. My hands stopped responding, and my chest tightened as if something inside had clenched shut. Without knowing why, I fixed my gaze on the rusted handle of the bathroom door in front of me, a brown, uneven stain against the gray metal. I stared at it for what must have been 10 or 15 seconds, though at that moment time meant nothing. I didn't go in. I didn't speak. I made no sound. I stepped away slowly, returned to the living room, sat down, and shook hands with someone whose name I can no longer remember. But deep inside me, in that cold and silent place where certainty forms, something had settled with absolute clarity. Lorena believed she had already won, and I had just decided that I would prove to her, through every document, every number, and every calculated step, how wrong she was. Everything we are comes from somewhere, and when that place disappears, you suddenly find yourself looking back with a painful clarity. Painful precisely because it comes too late. I was born in Valladolid in 1971, the second son of Isidro Torrealba and Consuelo Medrano, a woman with always busy hands and a calm voice who died when I was 32. My childhood was much like that of many children in Spain at the time, a country slowly transitioning from one era to another without fully knowing what it would find on the other side. I remember summers without hot water, winters with a brazier under the table, nor the news playing on a black and white television that my father watched in silence. arms crossed. I also remember the radio always on in the kitchen, and my mother singing songs I never fully learned. Isidro worked for 40 years in the same electrical components factory, never missing a single day except for strictly necessary reasons. That was his understanding of dignity. He never gave speeches about effort or responsibility. He simply got up every morning, put on his work overalls with the same natural ease others put on a suit, and went out. When I was 12, I asked him if he didn't get bored doing the same thing every day. He looked at me for a long moment and replied, "Someone who does what they're supposed to doesn't need further explanation." I didn't understand that sentence at the time. I understood it 20 years later, signed the day I signed an audit report that cost someone far more powerful than me their position. I studied economics in Valladolid, at a faculty that in the 1980s still smelled of chalk and cold, poorly heated hallways. I graduated in 1994 at just 22 years old, carrying a level of self-confidence that the working world managed to bring down to size in exactly 4 months. For a couple of years, I worked as an accounting assistant in a transport company until, in 1996, I passed the competitive exams to join the State Tax Auditor's Corps. The day I received the official notification of my position, I took it to my father on a folded sheet of paper, without an envelope. He read it slowly, folded it carefully again, and slipped it into his shirt pocket. He stayed silent for a while, then simply placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Well done." 2 words that, coming from Isidro, were the equivalent of a full speech. That same year, in September, I met Lorena. I've already described how that first encounter happened, but not what came after. The longest part, the one measured in years and accumulated silences. Lorena was an intelligent woman. I won't deny that, not even now. She had a presence that made people notice her when she entered a room, not because she was loud, but because of a quiet confidence that I mistook for strength of character for a long time. In the early years of our marriage, there was genuine support between us. She stood by me during difficult periods at work, and when our household finances required careful management, she handled them without complaint. There were good moments, and I refused to erase them, because doing so would be dishonest. But there were also changes that I was too busy to notice in time. Over the years, Lorena began to develop a particular relationship with material things, not in an obvious way, but gradually, almost imperceptibly. She started talking about the apartment, the car, the future, always in terms of ownership. Who would have what would be registered, and under whose name. At first, I saw it as financial prudence, something I appreciated given my own background. Then I interpreted it as a need for stability, understandable for someone who had grown up in a financially unstable environment. It took me too long to realize what it truly was, a constant inventory of everything she believed belonged to her, or should belong to her one day. My father never spoke badly of Lorena, but he never praised her beyond what basic courtesy required. Isidro reserved his opinions about people for moments when they truly mattered. Still, there is one memory I carry with striking clarity. The last Christmas we all spent together. In December 2022, my father was quieter than usual throughout dinner. Lorena spent much of the evening talking about a renovation she wanted to do in the main bathroom, about materials, about how much the apartment might be worth if we ever decided to sell it. Isidro listened without saying a word. At one point, when she went into the kitchen, my father looked at me and said in a very low voice, "That woman counts things before they are hers." I took it as the suspicion of an older man. I smiled and changed the subject. Today, that memory carries a weight that is hard to describe. Alvaro grew up in that home. As a child, he was calm. Later, he became a quiet, introverted teenager, and eventually a young man who moved to Madrid at 23 with a natural urge to build a life of his own away from his parents. I always understood and respected that. Our relationship was never particularly expressive, but it existed in its own way. I was there when he needed me, and he knew it. For a long time, I believed that was enough. Now I wonder how many times I mistook surface calm for the absence of real problems. During my father's illness, I began to notice something that, at the time, I chose not to examine too closely. Alvaro visited his grandfather regularly when he was in Valladolid, but he avoided being alone with me. Whenever we crossed paths in the hospital or in my father's building, he would look away too quickly, in a way that didn't feel natural. One afternoon, I tried to ask him directly if something was wrong. He told me he was tired, that his grandfather's situation was affecting him. That was all. I accepted it because I wanted to. My father's estate was modest, but entirely clean. The apartment on Recoleta Street, where he had lived for the past 30 years, valued at around 160,000 euros at the time, and a savings account with 74,000 euros accumulated over decades of steady work and careful spending. No debts, no mortgage, not a single figure that didn't add up. Everything built on discipline and routine, without dramatics, as he used to say. It was the result of a lifetime of honest effort, and someone had already begun to move it, slowly, carefully, hoping no one would notice. At that moment, I still didn't fully understand the scale of what I was about to uncover, but something inside me, that cold, analytical part shaped by 26 years of auditing other people's accounts, had already begun asking questions. And when an auditor starts asking questions, he doesn't stop until he finds what doesn't add up. There are moments the mind doesn't store as memories, but as physical sensations. Not images you can observe from the outside, but something that continues to happen inside your body every time you return to them. The hallway of my father's house is one of those places. Every time I recall it, I feel the cold wall against my forehead again. I smell the flowers. I hear that voice. Let me tell it slowly, because it deserves to be told that way. I stood up from the living room at 4:45 in the afternoon. I know because I looked at my father's wall clock as I got up, a dark wooden one with Roman numerals that had hung in the same place since I was 10 years old. The house was full, overlapping voices, the heavy scent of white funeral wreaths placed near the sideboard, the constant murmur of people offering condolences in hushed tones. I had spent hours in that living room receiving condolences, keeping my expression composed and my eyes dry, because I have always processed pain inwardly, slowly, privately, in silence. I needed a moment away from all of it. I stepped into the hallway without saying a word. It was a narrow hallway, with high ceilings and white walls that time had tinted into a shade somewhere between cream and ochre. On the left was the bathroom door, its handle slightly loose. On the right, half open, the door to the master bedroom. At the end, a small window with leaded glass let in a thin beam of light my mother used to call the afternoon slit. I leaned against the wall, closed my eyes, and tried to breathe. Then I heard Lorena's voice. She wasn't whispering. Over time, that's the detail that has unsettled me the most. She didn't lower her voice at all. She was speaking on the phone with the ease of someone completely certain she was alone. Her voice came clearly from the bedroom, sharp, effortless. The first thing I noticed wasn't the words, but the tone. Something about it didn't fit. It wasn't the voice of someone who had just lost her father-in-law. There was no trace of grief, no fatigue, none of the restraint you expect when people are mourning in the next room. It was a light voice, almost relaxed. Then the words came, "My father-in-law is dead." My body reacted before my mind did. My hands stopped responding, as if for a moment they had ceased to exist. The air halted in my chest, not as pain, but as a sudden, firm closure, like a door snapping shut. Without knowing why, I fixed my gaze on the bathroom handle in front of me. It was aged brass, with an irregular dark rust stain near the bottom. I kept staring at it while my mind struggled to process what I had just heard. There was a pause. Lorena was listening to the person on the other end of the line. I thought I heard a restrained, distant laugh. Then she spoke again. "Now only he's left." 3 words that in the days that followed would echo in my mind with a precision no other phrase from the past 27 years had ever achieved. Not the "I love you" from the early days. Not the promises at the altar. None of them. Just those three. Another pause, shorter this time. And everything they have will be mine. In that moment, barely seconds after stepping out of the living room in search of air, I stood completely still in the hallway. The smell of flowers and candle wax filled the space. I kept staring at that rusted handle, my heart beating in a way that wasn't fear or anger or sadness. It was something else. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that comes after weeks of reviewing accounts that seem perfectly in order, and suddenly finding the number that doesn't add up. Not the obvious mistake, not the one that jumps out, but the small one, hidden in a line no one checks because it seems insignificant. That was the moment when everything that had seemed normal suddenly rearranged itself, taking on an entirely different meaning. Years of reviewing documents teach you to recognize that precise point when what appears on the surface no longer matches what is actually real. What lay beyond that half-open door was not simply my wife saying something inappropriate on the worst possible day. It was something more complex, a structure, a plan carefully built over months, perhaps longer, on ground I had never bothered to watch, because I had never imagined I should distrust the person who shared my life. I didn't enter the room, and I didn't say a word. I slowly pushed myself away from the wall, moving almost on instinct, as if I were still operating on autopilot. I returned to the living room, sat down, as someone touched my arm and said something I didn't register. I nodded. I shook someone's hand. I nodded again. Outwardly, I was still the son who had just buried his father. Inwardly, something had begun to align itself with a cold precision, the kind that comes from knowing you cannot afford a single mistake. That night, back at our apartment, Lorena went to bed early. She said she was exhausted, and she probably was. I stayed in the living room, in the dark, for an undefined amount of time. No television, no noise, no distractions. Just the distant sounds of the street below and my own thoughts beginning to organize what I had just learned. That was when my father's words came back to me, clear and unmistakable. "Take care of what is yours, Agustín. Don't trust someone who suddenly starts taking too much care of you." He may not have known for certain, but he sensed it. In his own restrained way, he had tried to warn me without causing more harm than necessary. I didn't listen in time. That would not happen again. Over the years, tax auditors develop a kind of permanent flaw. We can't stop reading between the lines, not just at work, but everywhere, in a casual conversation, in a plumber's estimate, in the way someone arranges receipts in a drawer. A mind trained to detect inconsistencies doesn't switch off. It simply waits. During the 3 days following the funeral, I chose to observe. I didn't confront her. I didn't investigate directly. I let the silence do its work. Lorena moved through those days with a calm that, under other circumstances, I would have interpreted as emotional balance. She didn't break down in tears, handled condolence calls with composure, and managed the necessary arrangements with an efficiency I would have admired, if those words from the hallway hadn't remained etched in my mind with a clarity that time could not erase. 4 days after the funeral, on a Friday morning, I returned to my father's apartment under the pretext of collecting some documents the notary handling the estate had requested. Lorena didn't come with me. She said she had errands to take care of. I didn't ask for details. It was the first time I entered Isidro's home alone since his death. The smell was unchanged. That familiar scent of homes where elderly people have lived alone for years. A mix of aged wood, bar soap, and something harder to define, as if it were the trace of accumulated time. I stood still for a few moments at the entrance. Then I went to the bedroom. My father kept his important documents in a cardboard box covered with brown paper, placed on the highest shelf of the wardrobe, behind neatly folded winter sweaters. He used to call it, with his dry irony, "Oh, the poor man's chest." Inside was what he considered worth keeping: the family book, Social Security records, old employment contracts with worn stamps, receipts from a fully paid mortgage that he kept almost like trophies, and a small blue folder with more recent documents. I took the box down, placed it on the bed, and opened it. First, I found what the notary needed: his ID, the certificate of last wills, the original deed to the apartment. Everything was in order, exactly where it should be, just as Isidro would have wanted. He was meticulous even in the way he organized things. Every document had its place, and every place had its reason. Then I picked up the blue folder. Inside were 3 stapled documents I had never seen before. The first was a copy of a public deed. The heading, in that dense and formal style typical of notarial documents, indicated it was a donation with reservation of usufruct, signed in Valladolid. The date was clear, July 17th of the previous year, 4 months before my father's death. I read the document standing there beside the wardrobe, with the box still open on the bed. I read it once, then a second time more slowly. The legal language left no room for doubt. The property owner, Isidro Torrealba Vega, transferred full ownership of the apartment on Recoleta Street to the beneficiary, identified as Lorena Fuentes Palomino. He reserved for himself the right of lifetime usufruct, that is, the right to continue living in the apartment until his death. After that, full ownership would pass automatically to her. My father's apartment, the only real estate asset he had built through 40 years of work, had already been registered in my wife's name for months, without my knowledge. I lowered my gaze to my father's signature at the bottom of the document. Isidro Torrealba had a distinctive signature. I had seen it for years on contracts, school authorizations, bank papers. Broad, with a tall initial I, and a firm flourish that extended confidently to the right. But the signature on that document was different. The strokes were faint, uneven, with inconsistent pressure, the kind made by someone who doesn't fully control their hand. The initial barely held its shape, and the flourish stopped halfway, as if the hand had lost momentum before finishing. It was the signature of a man who was not fully in control of himself. I sat down on the edge of my father's bed. July 17th. I went back over the date in my mind with the precision that comes from years of working with records. By then, Juan Isidro had already been living for 6 months with advanced pancreatic cancer. In June, the doctors had adjusted his pain treatment because the previous doses were no longer enough. I remembered the conversation with the oncologist, a man in his 50s with metal-framed glasses, who explained in technical terms that from that point on, the treatment would be essentially palliative. Controlled-release morphine administered through patches, along with sedatives for episodes of agitation. On July 17th, my father had already been under that regimen for several weeks. Whoever took him to sign that document knew it. They knew exactly what condition he was in. They knew that an 80-year-old man, suffering from chronic pain and under heavy opioid medication, was not in a position to fully understand the consequences of a legal document. They knew he would trust, that he would sign whatever was put in front of him if someone close to him told him it was necessary. And someone close to him did. Then I remembered what Lorena had said that afternoon, almost casually while cooking, that she had gone with my father to sign a medical authorization, just in case. A light remark, designed to avoid further questions. But it hadn't been a medical authorization. It had been a donation. I remained sitting on the bed, the documents in my hands, the silence of the apartment surrounding everything. The cold afternoon light came through the window, falling over my father's belongings with that indifference natural light has toward anything human. I didn't cry. Not then. I carefully folded the papers, placed them back into the blue folder, and slipped it into the inner pocket of my jacket. Then I returned the box to its place behind the sweaters, exactly as I had found it. I closed the wardrobe and left the apartment. I shut the door gently, just as my father always insisted doors should be closed, because, as he used to say, doors don't need to be slammed. They just need to be closed. Out on the street, the November cold hit me immediately. I walked to the car without rushing, sat behind the wheel, and rested my hands there without starting the engine. That was when I understood, with a cold clarity that doesn't come from impulse but from certainty, that what Lorena had done was not spontaneous or a miscalculation. It was a carefully thought-out plan, executed at the precise moment when my father was least capable of resisting. And if there was a plan for the apartment, there had to be more. I didn't yet know how much, but I would find out. After 26 years of auditing accounts, there's one thing you learn above all. People can lie, documents don't. When you know how to read them, they always tell the truth. The following Monday, after discovering the deed, I arrived at the office at 8 sharp, like any other day, and I greeted my colleagues, answered a few emails, signed a pending report. On the outside, I was still the same auditor. On the inside, I was a man with a blue folder locked in his desk and a list of questions that needed answers before I could make any move. I made my first inquiry during lunch, using my own workstation and professional credentials. The property registry is accessible to any citizen, but in my case, access was more direct. In just 15 minutes, I had the full record of the apartment on Recoleta Street in front of me. Ownership had already been updated as of July 28th of the previous year. Owner, Lorena Fuentes Palomino. Lifetime usufruct holder, Isidro Torrealba Vega. The registration had been completed 11 days after the signing. 11 days. She had acted with a speed that left no room for doubt. It wasn't improvisation. It was planning. Then I checked the land registry. The change of ownership had also been processed in August of that same year. Everything was in order, properly registered, executed with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Or had someone who did. The operation was flawless in form. The only thing that couldn't be protected was the condition my father was in when he signed that document on July 17th. That afternoon, on my way home, I decided to take a detour from my usual route and parked in front of an office building on Santiago Street. Felix Izquierdo Peña had his office on the 3rd floor. I had known him for over a decade, having crossed paths with him in various proceedings where our fields overlapped. He was 62 years old, thin, with very short white hair, and wore rectangular framed glasses that gave him a stern appearance, one that his manner of speaking fully confirmed. He specialized in inheritance law and the annulment of legal acts, with 30 years of experience in Castilla y León. He wasn't the kind of lawyer who decorated his office with diplomas or displays. His workspace was minimal, shelves full of case files, on a functional desk with 2 monitors, and he had a clear reputation. He didn't take on cases he didn't intend to win. I laid everything out to him directly. I showed him the donation deed, the registry records I had checked that morning, and my father's medical history from that period, which I had requested from the hospital as a direct relative. Felix listened without interrupting. He took notes by hand, in small, compact writing. When I finished, he paused for a few seconds before speaking. "The donation can be challenged," he said at last. "It's not guaranteed to be annulled, but there are solid grounds. If it's confirmed that your father was under high doses of morphine and sedation on the day of the signing, we can argue lack of capacity to give valid consent." He added that an independent medical expert would be needed to evaluate the clinical records and determine my father's likely cognitive state at that time. With that report, the deed would be in serious trouble. I asked him how long the process might take. "That depends on the evidence we bring in from the start," he replied. "The stronger the case at the outset, the less room there is for delays. If you want to do this properly, do it thoroughly." I left his office with 2 clear certainties: that there was a path forward and that it wouldn't be quick. Neither of them surprised me. That same week, I contacted Victor Gallardo Fuentes. He is 57 years old and, outside of my immediate family, the person who knows me best. We've known each other since we were 12. I'd from school in the delicious neighborhood, where neither of us excelled at math but did reasonably well in everything else. He has spent 20 years working as a telecommunications technician. He's been divorced for 8 years and has a way of speaking that leaves no room for ambiguity. He's not the kind of person who tells you what you want to hear. He tells you what you need to know. We met on a Tuesday afternoon at a cafe in the city center, somewhere Lorena didn't usually go. I told him everything. No filters, no summaries, no softened version. Victor listened in silence, leaning forward, fingers interlocked, eyes fixed on me. When I finished, he exhaled slowly and said something I wasn't expecting. I saw them. I asked him to explain. It was in July. I don't remember the exact date, but definitely July, he said. I was walking along Cadenas de San Gregorio Street when I saw them coming out of a notary's office. Your father was walking slowly, with his cane, the way he did in those last months. Lorena was holding his arm. I thought it was just some routine matter, the kind of thing children handle for their elderly parents. It didn't seem strange. I didn't call you because I had no reason to. I told him there was a reason, and that it was exactly what I had just explained to him. Victor didn't hesitate. He said he would testify about what he had seen, including the approximate date and circumstances, that he would put it in writing before a notary if necessary, and that no one would have to ask him twice. He wasn't doing it for attention. His reason was different. 4 years earlier, something similar had been attempted with his own mother, less successfully, but with more noise. He knew what it felt like to realize that an elderly person's vulnerability could become a resource in someone else's calculations. That was enough for him. But what I discovered the next day completely changed the scale of what I was dealing with. And I had asked Felix to formally request from the bank the full transaction history of the joint account Lorena had opened with my father, invoking my status as a direct heir in the ongoing estate process. The statement arrived at the lawyer's office 2 days later in a sealed envelope. Felix handed it to me without comment, simply pointing to a column with his index finger. Recurring transfers. 1 every month, without exception, for 31 consecutive months. Always €300, always between the 18th and the 20th of each month, always to the same destination account. 31 months, €9,300 in total. Money withdrawn from an account that was supposedly meant to cover the care of an elderly, ill man. I asked Felix whether it was possible to identify the holder of the receiving account. He replied calmly that, within a legal proceeding, it was. Outside of one, it was more difficult, though there were ways to move forward without waiting for the case to begin. He paused, then added, "There's another point worth reviewing. If these transfers started 31 months ago, then the joint account was opened before your father's illness justified it. That changes the entire timeline." I ran the numbers in my head. 31 months back from November placed the start in April, 2.5 years before the funeral, even before my father was diagnosed with cancer. That account had not been created to cover medical expenses. It had existed before there was any illness at all. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a few seconds. Outside, Valladolid remained wrapped in a gray winter afternoon, completely indifferent to what was unfolding inside that office. I thought about Lorena that November night, going to bed early with what seemed like genuine exhaustion. I thought about the transfers, their almost perfect regularity over 31 months, and I realized that what lay beneath 27 years of marriage was far deeper than I had imagined. The expert report arrived on a Thursday morning, 16 days after Felix had commissioned it from Dr. Amparo Villanueva Roca, a forensic medical expert with extensive experience in evaluating cognitive capacity in civil and inheritance cases. 72 pages, technical language, precise medical references, conclusions written with the restraint of someone who knows the document will eventually be read aloud in a courtroom. Felix handed it to me without preamble. I sat across from him and went straight to the conclusions, as I always do with reports. That's where the essence is. Dr. Villanueva concluded, based on the complete medical history of Isidro Torrealba Vega, that on July 17th, the patient was under treatment with high doses of extended-release morphine, combined with additional medication to manage pain and agitation. She explained, citing medical literature, that this type of pharmacological combination in an elderly patient with significant physical deterioration typically causes episodes of sedation, temporal disorientation, a marked reduction in judgment, and increased susceptibility to influence from trusted individuals. The conclusion was unequivocal. At the time of signing, my father was not in a cognitive condition to fully understand the legal and financial implications of the document he had signed. I folded the report carefully and remained silent for a few seconds. Felix spoke first. With this, along with Victor Gallardo's testimony and the records you obtained from the Land Registry and Property Registry, we have sufficient grounds for a nullity claim. It won't be quick, but it will be solid. I nodded. Then I asked if he had identified the holder of the account receiving the transfers. This time he didn't respond immediately. He opened a thin folder beside him, took out a sheet of paper, and placed it in front of me with a calmness that did nothing to soften what it contained. The account holder was Marcos Andrade Quiles, 44 years old, living in Valladolid, at an address in the Parque Sol neighborhood. The documents listed him as being involved in sports-related activities. I read the name several times. A man 9 years younger than Lorena, living less than 4 kilometers from our home, receiving €300 a month for 2 years and 7 months, with near-perfect regularity, from an account in my father's and my wife's names, 31 payments, €9,300 in total. It wasn't an amount that would ruin anyone. It was something else, a steady, consistent flow of money, delivered with the ease of someone who has everything under control and isn't afraid of being questioned. Money that moves with the confidence of someone who feels safe. That night, when I returned home, Lorena made lentils. The smell filled the kitchen with the same normality as always, but it no longer felt familiar. It felt strange, distant. I sat at the table, ate, answered when she spoke. I asked about her plans for the next day in the same neutral tone as always. Nothing we said mattered. It was later, after she went to bed, that I broke for the first time. I locked myself in the bathroom, turned on the faucet to cover any sound, and sat on the edge of the bathtub, leaning forward, my face in my hands. It wasn't immediate. At first, it was a pressure that grew from my chest to my throat, until I could no longer hold it back. Then it came out, quietly, without relief. It wasn't a cathartic cry. It was pure exhaustion, the result of holding everything in for too long. I wasn't crying for the apartment, or the money, or a name on a registry. I was crying because my father, in his last lucid days, had been led by the hand to sign away everything he had, by someone he had always treated with a reserved politeness. And because I wasn't there, because I was at work, in meetings, and reviewing other people's files while the most important one, his, went unattended. Because I trusted someone who didn't deserve it and left Isidro exposed to something he, in his own way, had tried to warn me was happening. I opened the faucet a little more and splashed cold water on my face. I waited until my breathing steadied. Then I turned off the light and walked out. There's something I need to admit at this point, even if it isn't easy. During my father's illness, Lorena was present in ways that cannot be denied. There were afternoons when I arrived late from work and she was already at Isidro's apartment, having prepared dinner or sitting with him watching the news. She took calls when I couldn't. I especially remember a night in February when my father had a severe pain episode. I was out of town for work, and she went to the hospital in the middle of the night without being asked. That happened. And for a long time, I understood it as genuine care. Now I see it differently. It was a way of building trust. Every gesture, every visit, on every act of care was part of a measured process aimed at a specific goal. The dedication had a purpose, and that purpose was the apartment on Recoletas Street. And yet, that memory, her waiting in the emergency room that February night, doesn't disappear. It's also part of the whole truth. What came next I learned from Victor a week later, in the same cafe where we had met before. He had found out through a mutual contact, discreetly enough not to raise suspicion. Marcos Andrade had been working for 3 years as an instructor at a gym in the Rondilla neighborhood. Lorena had been a client there for 4 years, and Alvaro had crossed paths with him. Victor told me with visible discomfort. My son had had lunch with that man on 2 different occasions. The first, about a year and a half earlier, at a restaurant downtown. The second, 4 months before Isidro's funeral, at a bar near the bus station. I stayed silent. My son, 26 years old, knew the man who had been receiving money from his sick grandfather's account. He had seen him more than once, and he said nothing. Victor didn't add anything else. He didn't need to. On the drive back home, along the ring road, with the cold hitting the windshield, I understood that this was no longer just about a questionable donation. It was something much larger. There was a parallel relationship that could be documented, a steady flow of money originating from a vulnerable elderly man, a son who chose silence over honesty, and an entire structure built over years on the assumption that I would never look closely enough. They bet that I wouldn't. But I'd spent my entire life learning to look exactly where no one expects you to look. And there is a fundamental difference between acting on impulse and acting out of conviction. The first drains energy and leads to mistakes. The second requires something far more difficult, the ability to remain calm on the outside while everything inside you is burning. In the weeks following my conversation with Victor, I learned to maintain that composure with a precision I didn't know I possessed. The legal strategy took shape during a second meeting with Felix Izquierdo on a Wednesday in January, by which point the case file had grown significantly since the first visit. Felix laid out the plan without embellishment, with the clarity of someone well-versed in these kinds of cases. He outlined 3 main courses of action. The first was to file a civil claim to annul the donation, based on Dr. Villanueva's expert report regarding my father's cognitive state at the time of signing. This would be supported by Victor's testimony, having seen my father leave the notary's office, and by the complete medical history as documentary evidence. And the goal was clear, to have the donation invalidated and the apartment returned to the estate, where I held legal rights as an heir. The second path was divorce, grounded in the breach of trust within the marriage. This would include the bank records documenting the transfers to Marcos Andrade, along with any additional evidence that could clarify the nature of that relationship. Felix was straightforward. Infidelity alone rarely affects the division of assets, but when combined with the misuse of funds belonging to a vulnerable third party, it can influence the court's overall assessment. The third line of action was a civil claim to recover the money withdrawn from the joint account, 9,300 euros. It wasn't the largest amount involved, but it was the easiest to prove. Everything was documented, the transfers, the recipient, and the source of the funds. 3 fronts, each with its own weight, timeline, and supporting evidence, all pointing in the same direction. Before concluding, Felix added one more point. He noted that any statement from Lorena acknowledging the facts made in my presence could strengthen the case. Recordings in such circumstances are not always considered definitive evidence, but they can serve as supporting material within an already solid case. I didn't respond at the time. But 2 days later, on a Friday afternoon, while Lorena was at the gym, I placed a small voice recorder inside a slightly open drawer of the desk we shared at home. It was discreet, black, sound-activated, with a battery capable of running continuously for 72 hours. I didn't have to wait long. The following Tuesday, Lorena came into the study while I was reviewing some paperwork and began talking about the apartment on Recoleta Street with complete ease, as if everything had already been settled. She said she had been thinking about rearranging the layout, that the master bedroom needed a different setup, and that she had found some tiles that would work well for the bathroom. For several minutes, she went on about renovations, materials, and estimated costs, with a level of detail that left no room for doubt. At one point, almost casually, she mentioned that the paperwork had been in order for months, and that all that remained was to wait for the estate process to be completed so things could move forward more freely. I nodded. I told her it made sense to think ahead about those things. I asked if she had already checked prices. She said yes, that she had even spoken with a contractor and expected to start in the spring. In the spring. When she left the study, I stared at the slightly open drawer for a few seconds. Then I went back to what I had been doing, as if nothing had happened. That night, I came close to making the only serious mistake of the entire process. Lorena was sitting on the couch, phone in hand, replying to messages, with the television playing in the background. I walked in intending to read. I sat down, opened my book, and then she let out a brief, contained laugh. The kind that slips out when something is genuinely amusing and is quickly suppressed upon remembering you're not alone. That laugh wasn't random. It wasn't the laugh of someone casually reading something. I recognized it. It was the laugh of someone who has somewhere else to go, even if they never leave the room. I closed the book. I stood up and said I was going to the kitchen. There, standing by the sink with an empty glass in my hand, I was on the verge of going back and saying everything. Showing her the report, the bank records, the name Marcos Andrade, the deed, Victor's testimony, ending once and for all that exhausting facade of normality. It lasted only a few seconds. Then I turned on the tap, filled the glass, and drank slowly. I remembered what Felix had told me. The stronger the case at the outset, the less room there would be for counter-moves. A premature confrontation would only give her time to react, to shift whatever could still be moved, to build a version of events. The case had to be filed before she even knew it existed. I went back to the living room, picked up the book where I had left off. Lorena didn't even look up. During those weeks, I also put my own affairs in order. With Felix's help, I made sure that everything I had acquired before the marriage was properly documented, along with the origin of my personal funds. It wasn't a large amount, but it was clear, separate, and fully supported. When the time came, every figure would have its justification. At the same time, Felix took care of contacting the medical association to verify Dr. Villanueva's credentials in preparation for her possible role as a court expert. Everything checked out, fully in order and easily verifiable. The case file kept growing with the logic of a well-constructed audit. Step by step, each element supported by the previous one, with no loose ends or unsupported information. One afternoon in February, Victor called me with something else. He had casually spoken with a neighbor from my father's building, someone who had known him for years. She remembered seeing Lorena arrive by car with Isidro one day the previous summer, help him up the stairs, and then leave alone about 40 minutes later. She remembered the day clearly because it coincided with an elevator breakdown that had affected the entire building that week. She didn't know what it meant, but she hadn't forgotten it. Little by little, everything began to fit together. A neighbor, a friend, a medical report, official records, bank movements, a domestic recording with legal value, and a deed signed under questionable conditions that could no longer support what it was meant to justify. Meanwhile, Lorena continued planning for the future as if nothing had happened. She spoke about the apartment as if it already belonged to her. She made plans with the confidence of someone who believes every angle has been covered. One afternoon, almost casually, she mentioned that in a few years they might sell the apartment if something better came along, that it was an asset that offered options. An asset. That's what she called the place where my father had lived for 3 decades, where my mother died in her own room because she wanted to pass away at home, where every object carried years of life. Felix set the filing date for the lawsuit for the first week of March. 3 weeks remained. Lorena still suspected nothing, and by then the case was already irreversible. No one talks about the exhaustion that comes from maintaining a facade for weeks. Not just physical fatigue, though that exists and builds, but the deeper kind. The strain of controlling every gesture, every tone, every silence, so that it fits exactly what is expected. Nothing more. Sleeping next to someone you no longer recognize. Sitting at the same table, responding as if everything were normal, smiling when a normal man would smile. During that February, it was the most exhausting work I had ever done. Even after 26 years auditing companies with irregularities their owners preferred not to see. The first real crack appeared on a Wednesday afternoon at the office. I had requested a complete copy of my father's medical file from the hospital to reinforce the expert report. The envelope arrived at my desk inside a beige folder with the hospital's letterhead printed in the corner. I opened it with the intention of reviewing only the medication dates, the only detail we needed at that moment. Inside the file, between two medical reports, I found a small envelope folded in half. It had no letterhead. On the back, in my father's handwriting, it read, "For Agustín, when the time comes." I held it for a few minutes without opening it. Around me, the office carried on as usual. Keyboards, phones, conversations. I, on the other hand, sat still, holding that envelope as if it were something fragile that could be damaged by the slightest wrong movement. Eventually, I opened it carefully. Inside were 2 handwritten pages by Isidro. I recognized his writing immediately. Firm, compact, the same I had seen for years on grocery lists, birthday notes, and holiday cards. There was no date, but it was clear he had written it in his final months, when he could still hold a pen steadily enough. I won't repeat what the letter said, and some things belong only to the person who receives them, but I will say this. In that letter, my father spoke about me with a sincerity he had never shown out loud. He admitted he had been a man of few embraces and high expectations, and he confessed, true to his usual restraint, that the pride he felt for the man I had become was the kind that isn't spoken because it feels embarrassing, but is no less real for it. At the end, almost like a closing note, there was a single sentence that I struggled to read without my vision blurring. "Don't let anyone take away what you built, neither mine nor yours." He knew. Until the very end, he knew. I stood up and went to the bathroom. I locked the door, turned the faucet on full, and leaned over the sink, letting the sound of the water drown everything else out. I stayed there until I regained control. When I returned to my desk a few minutes later, the letter was already tucked into the inner pocket of my jacket, alongside the blue folder I had carried with me since the day I found it. I finished the workday as usual. Signed what needed signing, answered emails, left at my usual time. The second crack was different, harder to manage, because it happened in front of others. One evening in mid-February, Lorena invited her sister Encarna and her husband Rodrigo over for dinner. It was an ordinary gathering, the kind that repeats itself from time to time without any purpose beyond routine. I was sitting in my usual place, taking part in the conversation just enough not to stand out. At one point, while clearing the first course, Lorena brought up the apartment on Recoleta Street. She did it with a naturalness that is still difficult to process. She said it was a shame it hadn't been renovated earlier, that the area had increased in value a lot, and that once all the post-death procedures were finished, they could fix it up and rent it out to generate income. Encarna nodded without questioning anything, with that typical attitude at family gatherings. Rodrigo added that the rental market in the city center was strong. Lorena smiled calmly, as if she were talking about something already settled. I kept eating, drank some water, and joined the change of topic that followed. It was something about construction work on Encarna's street. For the rest of the dinner, I said nothing out of the ordinary. But there was a moment, while Lorena laughed at something Rodrigo had said, when I looked at her with a different kind of clarity. It wasn't anger or sadness. It was something colder, the feeling of holding all the pieces in my hand and simply waiting for the right moment to use them. 3 days later, Alvaro called to say he would come to Valladolid for the weekend. He arrived Saturday at noon, with his usual travel backpack and that same way of entering the house that hadn't changed since he was 16. We had lunch together. The conversation was polite and superficial, the kind that fills space without really filling anything. In the afternoon, while Lorena was out running an errand, Alvaro came into the study where I was working and closed the door carefully. He sat across from me and remained silent for a few seconds, as if weighing his words. "Dad, I want to talk to you." I looked at him. I waited. "I think there are things you should know. About what happened with Grandpa. About some decisions." He fell silent. He held my gaze with the discomfort of someone who has rehearsed a conversation and, when the moment comes, realizes the words no longer work the same way. I said nothing. I looked at him calmly, without pressure, without urgency. I waited for him to continue, but in those few seconds I had already understood, because what I didn't say made it clear enough that I already knew everything, and that the moment when he could have acted had passed months ago. Alvaro lowered his eyes, nodded slowly, as if accepting something he had feared. He stood up, said he was going out for a while, and closed the door with the same quiet care with which he had opened it. We didn't talk again that weekend about anything that really mattered. I found the third crack on my own, one early morning at the end of February. I had been unable to sleep for a couple of hours when I decided to get up and go to my father's apartment. I had a key. Everything was just as it had been, waiting for the inventory procedures to be completed. I entered quietly, turning on only the hallway light, and went straight to the living room. Isidro's armchair was still in its place, by the window, facing the switched-off television. A dark fabric chair, its armrests slightly worn at the edges, the same one he occupied every afternoon with the newspaper folded in half and his glasses resting on his forehead. I sat in it. The place was completely silent. Through the window, the orange glow of the streetlights filtered in, casting long shadows across the walls. It smelled closed up, of dust that had gathered over just a few months, and, more faintly still, of that scent of Isidro that I wouldn't know how to describe, except to say it was my father's smell, and that, sooner or later, it would fade away. I also wondered whether any of it was worth it, not the legal process or the strategy, but the whole thing, whether 40 years of honest work, of a life built with judgment and effort, of a marriage that at some point had been real, even if it no longer was, could end up reduced to a file in a lawyer's office and a name in a land registry. I found no answers that night, but I found no reason to stop either. March arrived in Valladolid with a dry, persistent cold that slipped through the frames of old windows and made the hallway parquet creak in the early hours. It was the kind of cold that doesn't fully lift even at midday, that settles in with the intention of staying and forces people to walk quickly through the streets, hands in their pockets and eyes lowered. For me, however, those first weeks of the month had a completely different temperature. Inside, everything was utterly still. The kind of stillness that comes before things that cannot be undone. The case file was closed, not in the sense that it couldn't grow further, but in the sense that it was already enough. Felix had told me so with his usual brevity in our last meeting in February. What we have is solid. Adding more documentation now would be piling on out of inertia, not necessity. We had reached the point where continuing to build the case was simply a way of delaying the inevitable, and I had already spent too many weeks postponing what already had a date. The date was set for Tuesday, March 12th. Felix chose it with a sense of balance, allowing enough time for the notice to reach Lorena within the proper legal deadlines, but without unnecessarily prolonging the period during which I had to keep up that fabricated normality. When he told me over the phone, I wrote the date in the margin of a sheet of paper on my desk, looked at it for a moment, and circled it before continuing with what I had been doing. There were 12 days left. During that time, Lorena carried on with a calmness that, from where I stood, felt almost unsettling. Not because it was feigned, but precisely because it was genuine. The ease of someone who has no reason to suspect that the ground beneath her feet is no longer where she believes it to be. She made plans, took calls, and made decisions about the future with the natural confidence of someone grounded in a stable present. One Thursday afternoon, she came home with a home decor magazine and left it open on the dining table, pointing to a photograph of a renovated bathroom in light tones. She asked what I thought. I told her it looked nice. She nodded, pleased, and said it was very close to what she had in mind for the apartment on Calle Recoletas. I agreed. Then she closed the magazine and went into the kitchen. I stayed looking at the cover for a few seconds before moving it aside and returning to what I'd been doing. There was something oddly ordered about those days, a kind of precise geometry in the distance between what Lorena believed was happening and what was actually taking place. 27 years of marriage reduced to an invisible crack, on vast as a continent, that we both crossed every morning without naming it. She because she didn't know it existed. I because I knew exactly where it ended. The Saturday before the summons, Alvaro called. I answered in the study. The conversation was brief. He asked how I was, and I said I was fine. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind that carries more weight than the words around it. Then he said he wanted to come to Valladolid soon, that there were things he needed to sort out. I told him to come whenever he liked, that the door was open, and hung up. There was no resentment in my words, but no warmth either. It was simply the truth. The door remained open, though what lay on the other side was no longer the same as when Alvaro left for Madrid at 23, with his backpack and his plans. I didn't tell him that. There would be a time for that conversation, and that wasn't it. I spent Sunday alone in my father's apartment, finishing the review of the documents Felix needed properly organized for the following day's filing. I brought the entire case file, the original deed of gift along with its registered copy, Dr. Villanueva's expert report, 72 pages with clear conclusions, the bank statements from the joint account with the 31 transfers highlighted, Victor's notarized statement, the additional testimony from the neighbor that Felix had formally obtained, and the transcript of the relevant excerpts from the domestic recordings he himself had reviewed and selected according to legal criteria. I arranged each document in its corresponding folder. I checked that the page numbering was continuous and that the annexes followed the order indicated in the index. I did it with the same precision with which I had reviewed hundreds of case files over 26 years of my career, except that this time it was not a company with accounting irregularities. It was my own marriage, my father's home, 40 years of honest work by a man who never needed anyone to explain to him why he got up each morning. When I finished, it was 8:15 in the evening. I washed my hands in the small sink in my father's bathroom, the one whose hot water tap always took exactly 3 minutes to warm up. I dried them with the towel that still hung from the same hook where Isidro had left it for the last time. I turned off the light. In the hallway, I paused for a moment in front of the bedroom door, the same door that had been left ajar on the day of the funeral, 4 months earlier, when Lorena's voice had come from inside. Now it was closed. The brass handle, slightly tarnished, was unchanged, with that irregular stain on the lower part, brown against the dull metal. I looked at it for a few seconds, then picked up the folders, put them in my bag, and went out into the street. On Monday, Felix filed the claims with the Court of First Instance in Valladolid, the civil action for nullity of the deed of gift due to defect of consent, the contested divorce with evidence of infidelity and misappropriation of funds, and the civil claim for the 9,300 euros taken from the joint account. 3 separate proceedings, supported by the same case file, all filed on the same day. He confirmed the filing by phone at 12:40 p.m., while I was sitting at my desk in the office with a cup of coffee that had gone cold without me noticing. He only said, "Filed. The court will notify within the established time frames." I thanked him, hung up, drank the cold coffee, and continued with the report in front of me. That afternoon, Lorena got home before I did. When I arrived, she was in the kitchen preparing dinner with the radio on, a music station she usually listened to at that hour. She greeted me normally and asked whether I wanted to eat early or later. I told her whenever she preferred. I hung my coat on the rack in the hallway and went into the study. I sat down in the chair and looked at the table for a few seconds. On Tuesday, March 12th, Felix would call Lorena under the pretext of a necessary meeting to review the documentation for Isidro's estate inventory, a routine matter that no heir questions in the months following a death. She would go without suspecting anything. I knew it because that's how trust works when it has never been challenged. It doesn't trigger alarms or caution. It simply opens the way. From the kitchen came the smell of sautéed vegetables and the sound of the radio playing a song I didn't recognize. Lorena hummed for a few moments, and then the sound of running water drowned everything else out. The next day, at 11 in the morning, in Felix Izquierdo's office on Calle Santiago, Aunt Lorena would walk in thinking she was going to sign inventory documents and would find something entirely different waiting for her on the other side of the table. That Tuesday, March 12th, I got up at 6:15, not because I had to, but because after 3 hours staring at the ceiling in the dark, staying in bed no longer made any sense. I dressed slowly in the clothes I had laid out the night before on the bedroom chair. Dark suit, white shirt, gray tie. It was the same attire I wore for formal proceedings. It wasn't a minor detail, but a statement of intent that no one would notice except me. I had breakfast alone in the kitchen. Lorena was still asleep. At 7:40, I left the apartment quietly and walked to the car parked on the street. The morning cold was sharp and damp, like the kind that slips in through the collar of your coat no matter how tightly you fasten it. I walked slowly, in no hurry. The meeting was at 11, and it was barely 8. I had plenty of time to do what I wanted before going to Felix's office. I went to my father's apartment. I went in, turned on the hallway light, and headed straight to the living room. The dark wooden clock with Roman numerals was still hanging on the wall above the sideboard. It read 8:03. It had always worked with the same precision that Isidro maintained in everything else, punctual, without fuss, the way things are meant to be done properly. I stood in front of it for a moment, without sitting down or touching anything, just looking at it. Then I turned off the light and left. I arrived at Felix Izquierdo's office at 10:20. Victor Gallardo was already there, and sitting in one of the waiting area chairs, still wearing his coat and with an expression that wasn't quite solemn, but not quite anything else either. He shook my hand without saying a word. There was no need. Felix received us in his inner office. On the table were 2 neatly arranged folders, the usual glasses of water, and the same practical austerity of someone who doesn't need staging to do his job well. In about 10 minutes, we went over how the meeting would unfold. Felix would speak first. I would step in when he gave me the floor. Victor would remain in the room as a civil witness, silent unless directly addressed. At 11:05, the secretary announced that Lorena had arrived. She came in with her coat unbuttoned and her bag resting on her forearm, moving with the natural ease she always showed in formal settings. She paused briefly when she saw me, a moment of stillness that could easily have been taken for ordinary surprise. Then she composed herself and walked over to the chair Felix indicated across the table. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said in a neutral tone, assessing the situation before deciding how to position herself within it. I told her it was necessary. She sat down, folded her hands over her bag, and looked at Felix, expecting the start of what she believed was an administrative meeting. Felix opened the first folder and spoke for 22 minutes without interruption or any change in tone. He laid out each element with deliberate precision, aware of the weight of each piece and the exact order in which they needed to be presented for the whole to be unassailable. He began with the deed of gift, the date, the identification of the signatories, and the medical condition of Isidro Torrealba Vega at the time, supported by Dr. Villanueva's expert report. He placed the document on the table, opened to the conclusions page and oriented toward Lorena. She looked at it but did not touch it. Next came the statements from the joint account, arranged chronologically. 31 months of transfers, with the destination account highlighted on each line. Felix named Marcos Andrade Quiles, giving his full name and address, explained the nature of the documented relationship, and pointed out that it had begun several months before the joint account was opened. At that point, Lorena stopped looking at the documents. She fixed her gaze somewhere on the wall behind Felix and remained that way for the rest of the presentation. Then came Victor's written statement, describing what he had witnessed in July outside the notary's office on Calle Cadenas de San Gregorio. After that, the testimony of the neighbor from the building. Finally, the transcript of the relevant excerpts from the domestic recording selected by Felix, including the remark about the paperwork already being in order and the plans for renovation in the spring. When Felix finished, the silence lingered for a few seconds. Lorena spoke first. Her voice aimed for firmness, but hovered on the edge of it. "This is manipulation. What happened with the apartment was Isidro's decision. No one forced him. He wanted to do it." Felix replied with the same calm tone. "That is precisely what the court will determine. The expert report indicates that at the time of signing, the donor did not have the cognitive capacity required to understand the implications of the act. That is the basis of the claim. The final assessment rests with the judge." "There was no relationship," Lorena shot back, her voice rising slightly. "Those transfers are personal loans that I intend to repay." Felix gestured to the statements on the table, still composed. 31 months without a contract, without interest. Oh, and without any formal acknowledgement of debt. In the context of a contested divorce with evidence of infidelity, the classification of those transactions will also be determined by the judge. It was then that Lorena looked directly at me for the first time since she had entered the office. She was searching my face for something, a doubt, a crack, any sign that this could still be reframed. I held her gaze without difficulty, without anger or satisfaction, simply still, my hands resting on the table and my back straight. That was what unsettled her. Not the documents, not Felix's words, not Victor's presence across the room, but my silence, the complete absence of any emotion she could latch onto. "You've been planning this for months," she said, a mix of accusation and disbelief, like someone who has just realized that the ground she thought was solid has been shifting beneath her for some time. I didn't respond. There was no need. What followed was more restrained than I had expected. There was no scene, no visible collapse. Lorena has always been a woman of great control, and that control did not entirely abandon her, not even then. What did break was her sense of certainty, that particular, almost structural confidence she had carried for months as if it fit her naturally vanished in the time it took her to read the conclusions of the expert report and to see her own name next to Marcos Andrade's on the same official document. When Felix told her she could review everything with her own lawyer before making any formal statement, Lorena picked up her bag, stood up slowly, and walked toward the door without saying anything else. She paused for a moment at the threshold, her back to us. She did not turn around. She left. Victor let out a quiet breath through his nose, like someone who had been holding it longer than usual. Felix closed the folders with his usual precision. I remained seated for a few moments longer, looking at the table, the untouched glasses of water, the impeccable arrangement of documents that had taken months to prepare and only 22 minutes to present. I didn't feel relief. That wasn't it. It was closer to the feeling when a long process reaches the point where it no longer depends on you. A kind of functional ending, without drama or ritual, with the same restraint as any job well done coming to a close. As we said goodbye, Felix shook my hand and explained that everything would proceed as normal, that he would keep me informed of each court notification, that the annulment of the donation would take the longest, though the case had been solidly built. I stepped out into the street with Victor. We walked a block in silence before he spoke. "You did it right." I replied that I had learned from someone who never needed more than 2 words to say what mattered. Victor nodded. Nothing more was needed. Justice, when it comes through the proper channels, does not arrive with noise. It comes in registered letters, in notifications with case numbers, in rulings read by a clerk in the same tone regardless of their content. No one tells you at the beginning that the end of something that has taken months of your life, of silence, of calculation, of a pain that didn't always have a place to go, arrives on official paper with letterhead and a stamped seal. The annulment of the donation was resolved 14 months after the claim was filed. The Court of First Instance in Valladolid declared the deed dated July 17th invalid due to defect of consent, relying primarily on Dr. Villanueva's expert report and the complete medical records of Isidro Torrealba Vega. The apartment on Calle Recoletas was reintegrated into the estate with all its legal effects. As a forced heir entitled to the full statutory share, I received full ownership of the property, valued at €160,000. The claim for the funds diverted from the joint account was resolved sooner, with a favorable judgment that included accrued interest from the date of the first transfer. The total amount ordered by the judge was €23,200, which was fully repaid within the established time frame. The divorce was granted as a contested proceeding. The community property was liquidated in accordance with the law, unsupported by the documentation Felix had prepared from the outset to establish each party's separate assets. Lorena left the marriage without the inheritance she had tried to secure for months, without the financial backing of 27 years of shared life beyond what the law minimally recognized, and with her name tied in a court file to the fax that file recorded with documentary precision. I don't know what became of Marcos Andrade Quiles. I didn't look into it. It wasn't part of what I needed to resolve. As for how all of this began, what remains is the image of a man who, on the worst day of his life, stepped into the hallway to catch his breath, overheard something he shouldn't have, and in a matter of seconds decided what to do with it. That ended the day Felix called to inform me of the annulment ruling. I hung up, sat at my desk in the office for a few minutes, and then went back to the report I had pending. There was no celebration. I didn't seek one. That wasn't the point. The conversation with Alvaro was not how I had imagined it during those months. He came to Valladolid on a Saturday in May, weeks after what had happened in Felix's office. He arrived more serious than usual, without his usual backpack, with an expression somewhere between regret and something that still hadn't fully settled. We sat in the living room of my father's apartment, which by then was legally mine. The afternoon light came in through the window, and the familiar silence filled the space. He told me he was sorry, that he had made a serious mistake, that he had chosen wrongly when he should have chosen otherwise, and that he had known it even before everything came to light. I listened without interrupting him. When he finished, I replied with the same calm I had maintained throughout everything before. I told him I believed him, that I had no doubt his regret was sincere, that my affection for him had not disappeared and would not disappear, because that's not how it works between a father and a son, at least not between us. But that affection and support are not the same thing, and that support, in all its forms, had ceased to exist the day he chose to protect his own comfort over his grandfather's dignity and his father's honor. It wasn't a punishment. I used that word deliberately so there would be no misunderstanding. It wasn't about anger or retaliation. It was about consequences. And consequences are not negotiated or softened by late apologies, no matter how sincere they may be. They exist because actions exist, and they last as long as they must. Alvaro said nothing for a long while. Then he nodded slowly, his head slightly bowed. He stood up, gave me a brief hug, something I hadn't expected, picked up his coat from the chair, and left. That was the most honest farewell we had had in a long time. I imagine that at this point, after hearing all of this, one might wonder whether, with everything resolved and in its place, the person telling the story feels well. It's a fair question. I asked it of myself many times before finding an answer. And the answer is that it isn't simply a matter of feeling well. There is a clear, tangible outcome. The apartment where my father lived for 3 decades remains in the family. His memory will not be tied to that of an old man who was stripped of everything while still alive. The money that left his account over 31 months was recovered with interest by court order. And the person who built that entire scheme with patience and calculation faced the legal consequences. Without me ever having to step outside the bounds of the law. That, without embellishment, is good. But there is also something no ruling can restore. The time when my father was ill while I remained at the office. The conversations we never had, in part because neither of us really knew how to have them. The letter he left for me, hidden among medical reports, written at a time when he could still hold a pen, and which I found months after he was gone. Too late for him to know whether I had read it. I have carried that letter with me ever since, folded in the inner pocket of my jacket, The same one where I placed the blue folder when I left Isidro's apartment that Friday in November. I haven't framed it or stored it anywhere special. It remains there in that pocket, because that is where he left it, among medical papers, as if trusting that it would reach the right hands at the moment it was needed. One Sunday in June, about 3 weeks after receiving the annulment notice, I returned to the apartment on Calle Recoletas in the afternoon. I went in, turned on the hallway light, and moved through the room slowly, like someone with nowhere in particular to go. I stopped in the living room. The dark wooden clock was still hanging above the sideboard, with its Roman numerals and its steady, precise ticking. I stood there watching it for quite a while. Isidro had bought it at a hardware store in the city center in 1978, when I was 7 years old, and he had just finally secured the morning shift after years of requesting it. He mentioned it to me once, in passing, the way he spoke about important things, without emphasis, without making them seem important. I bought it when I finally started sleeping peacefully. That was all. It had been in the same place for 46 years. It had outlasted my mother, several renovations of the apartment, the months of illness, and everything that came after. I stepped closer to the sideboard, took the letter out of the inner pocket of my jacket, unfolded it carefully, and read it once more from beginning to end, under the living room light, while the clock kept marking time with the same quiet steadiness as always. The last line my father wrote said, "Don't let anyone take away what you've built, neither mine nor yours." I folded the letter again, put it away, and looked at the clock. It was still keeping perfect time. If you found this story interesting, you can support us by leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for being here.